Okay, so my video is fine. Okay. That'll be it. All right. Can we do it smaller?
Not that this matters much, but I always set my watch a little fast so I don't get eluded with time and things like that.
Mm.
So I looked at it and thought, oh, we should be underway, but not quite.
Not quite. We've got a couple more minutes, and folks will probably join us late, and that's okay too. They'll just pop in and out as needed, and
Sure.
yeah, just be flexible. Let people join us when they can, which should be good. I just got the clock on my other laptop fixed today. It was off by, it was like 11 and a half hours behind. It was very strange. I still don't know how it happened. But anyway, finally got that resolved today. So I can actually trust the clock on my computer again, which is nice. Good feeling. Thanks for everyone who's joined us. We're up to 31. That's excellent. We still have a couple more minutes and then we'll get started.
Rachel, could you,
Yes.
is there a way to boost your volume by a couple of decibels?
My own volume?
Yeah, so I can hear you.
I can try. I don't know if my microphone, I can, is it if I'm just closer to the computer, is that better?
Yeah.
Or I can talk louder?
Yeah.
Okay.
Kristen, I was in close to, so I could hear everything, but I backed off a little bit, so.
Okay. Yep. No, I can speak louder. No problem.
Okay.
And I saw a question from a participant. Usually you have to mute, but you don't see that. Are you all muted? Yes, you are currently all muted, and it will remain that way. We have this set up as a Zoom webinar as opposed to a Zoom meeting. And so because of that, it might look a little different, but we cannot see you. We cannot hear you. I can see your names in a list of attendees. But that's all I have on, and that's all that Graham has on his end as well. So we can just see a list of your names or whatever you entered as your name, and you don't have to worry about being seen or heard. Safe to eat lunch or pet the dog or whatever you need, whenever you need to do. Okay, well, I've got 3 o'clock on my end. We've got about 42 people with us at the moment, which is wonderful. So we'll get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Rachel Portinga, and I am a PhD student at Lakehead University. I'm helping to put this on through an internship with Roots to Harvest here in Thunder Bay, Ontario. And I'm also a student with the Sustainable Food Systems Lab through Lakehead. So I appreciate that you've joined us today. If you do need to skip out early, this is being recorded right now, and that recording will be made available on the Roots to Harvest YouTube page, which will be linked to their website as well, and it will be emailed to everyone who registered for the webinar. So lots of opportunities to watch it later. Again, if you need to, or just if you have to skip out early, you can catch the end of it at a later time. We also wanted to point out that we've put together a list of resources that might be helpful for folks growing in the Thunder Bay area or just in a short growing season, wherever you might be. And so those are available on the Roots to Harvest website as well under workshops. So you can find that document there all summer long. We'll be updating it throughout the summer as it progresses, adding resources that are appropriate for the time of year. As we get to the point of weeding and get to the point of pruning, we'll be adding some of those details. And finally, for any questions that you have today, please use the Q&A. So if you're new to a webinar or new to Zoom, go ahead and move your mouse around right now. And when you do that, you should see 3 options appear at the bottom, and one of them is a Q&A option. And when you select that, a window will appear, and you can write questions there, and then I'll be able to see those and share those with Graham at the end for questions. So we do plan, once I'm done in just a moment, Graham will take over for about the next 25-ish minutes and share some information with you. And then after that, we'll have Q&A, and I will read those questions out for Graham to answer. If you have any feedback about the webinar in general, please go ahead and send that to my email address posted here, and I'll put it in the chat at the end as well, rporting@lakeheadu.ca. So with those logistics out of the way, a reminder, this is recorded, but we cannot see you, we cannot hear you. We're glad that you're here, and ask questions through the Q&A. And with that, Graham, I will let you take over and take us through some information.
Thanks, Rachel. And we'll go to the next intro slide. And I'll talk about a few things about gardening in the north in this talk today. First of all, I have 2 technical experts helping me today, Rachel at the school, and also Kirsten, my wife, in the house. And so we'll begin with The slide I hope you're seeing now, that's the cover of my book called Gardening with Short Growing Seasons. And today I'm going to talk about a little bit about some of the challenges that probably you know already, most of you, about gardening in the north and why it's worthwhile doing, especially these days. And a lot of my talk will be centering on how to cope with cold weather. And maybe at the end we'll touch on climate trends, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So let's start with a map of Canada, and it's not a cheery map because it's a list of and display of the growing zones in Canada. And it pretty much goes from very cold in the north to suitable in the south, in southwestern Ontario, the Maritimes, and some valleys in BC and Alberta. But you can see Lake Superior pretty much in the middle of the screen. And we have, to the north of us, we have zone 1, and around Thunder Bay, we have zones 2, A and B. And if you go a little bit out to the west, Fort Frances area, we're up to 3. So the higher the number, the more options you have in growing food. My contention is that if we do gardening properly, with a couple of techniques I'll talk about today, we can gain one or two zones. And exactly what that means for you, I'm not sure. I'm assuming today that there is a range of people, gardeners. Some people probably are gardening in the first time they've done it, and others are quite experienced. And there's probably people who know more about this than I do. That being said, we'll proceed with the next slide. And that's why should you bother? And I've organized this into the 4 F's. Food quality, I think that's a fairly obvious one, and finances. That's a bit of a mixed kind of situation, because if you ever dared to cost what your labor costs in gardening, probably anywhere, you'd find that it's a fairly expensive proposition. But the point is that you have good quality, and especially right now, you have food security. And that's much more apparent in these times of pandemic and such. We don't know for sure that all our food will arrive on time, etc. And probably the most important, gardening is a lot of fun. I won't go into how therapeutic it can be. If you know that already, you don't have to explore it. But there's lots of literature about how satisfying and soothing gardening can be. So let's start with some, I think, really good news, and that is the advantages we have in northern gardening. We have a lot of sun and light. And if we compare to some areas, if we have, say, some areas of southern Ontario or the Midwest with coal generating electric plants, we have better air, better air quality, both for breathing, but also the amount of sunlight that reaches our plants. And we also have distance from many of the insect pests that plague certain areas to the south and the east of here. And we have pollination. We have a lot of pollinators, including even black flies, but they may not be as appreciated as bees. And another plus in our area is that the rainy season coincides with our growing season. most of our rainfall in northern Ontario. And I'm assuming most people are from Thunder Bay and northwestern Ontario. That may not be the case. Other people from other place can be tuning in. But our rainy season here begins after the snow season, begins in pretty much in May and continues through September. So the rainiest months of the year are those ones I just listed. And that coincides very nicely with when we want moisture in our gardens. And so that's compatible. We don't often use a lot of irrigation as they do in some areas like California, BC. They are very dependent on artificial rain crops going onto the garden. That's a very big plus. Doesn't mean you don't have to attend and water your garden, but it means that most of it happens naturally without you doing very much. Of course, the limitations are that we have cool temperatures that is going to limit what we can grow, and the growing season is pretty short. And for some people, there'll be other issues about soils. The good news there is that we can change that. We can add mulch, manure, and so on to our soils, and over time improve them so they have more nutrition and retain moisture more to our liking. So a favorite of mine and part of the overlap for me in gardening is the using the weather we have and making it work for us. The diagram you see on your left-hand side is a typical sunny day, and we have a little cloud, and you can see some of the rays of the sun are reaching the ground and heating. Some are going through the cloud and reaching the ground, and some are being reflected. But mostly we have enough direct sunshine in the summertime, in the growing season, to do most of what we want. The catch is that we have overnight cooling, and we have more than a lot of different areas would have. So you can see on the middle diagram there, we have long wave radiation radiating from the Earth itself. Not to get too technical, but this is how cooling happens at night. And we have some of those, the heat from the Earth being rising up and being reflected back by the cloud on the left of that diagram. And in the moisture in the air, we also have some warmth return to our garden. And we also have, in the other right-hand side area, we have direct radiation into outer space. So the temperature at the ground cools quite rapidly, especially in dry air and no cloud situations. So the temperature is not quite desert-like, but it cools very rapidly as soon as the sun goes down. And I'll show you in the next slide a little profile of what is happening with the temperature. So this is one of those bad news mornings, because the temperature is forecast to go down to 0, and the temperature does reach, in our little scenario here, it reaches 0 at the ground because of radiation of all that heat from the ground itself. But if we go upward, even a meter or 2 or 3, we'll find that temperature on the y-axis to the left, the temperature, with height and the temperature is actually rising as we go up. So the coldest place will be right on the ground. Now, if we had a way of pulling down the air from just a few meters up, we could average that temperature. That's not easy unless you have commercial fans and so on to mix that bottom air and make it compatible with what's happening at ground level. But there's other ways to do that. I'll get to some of the critical temperatures that we have to worry about. Obviously, with tomatoes and warm weather crops, if we have 2 degrees frost, they're in big trouble. Even at 5 degrees, your tomatoes and peppers and basil will be going into shock because of the cold temperatures. So it's worthwhile remedying those kind of temperatures. And I'll show that in a slide or two, how we can do that. Interestingly enough, you might think that more heat is better. That's true up to a certain point with some vegetables. It's not true at all with lettuces and things like that because they'll never want to have temperatures of 30 degrees. But even crops and and vegetables like tomatoes and corn, if the temperature gets up to around 30 degrees, they go into shock also. They shut down and they don't produce anymore because they're busy conserving moisture. So a couple of ways that we can retard the amount of heat leaving our garden is demonstrated in this slide here. So we, in effect, create a microclimate, a small climate that we control. On the left-hand side, you see a greenhouse there. I'll just mention that this is in Atikokan, and the greenhouse was built with salvaged materials from a school that was being, I guess the windows were being replaced in it. So the people in the slide got the windows, built a greenhouse, basically, besides labor, built it for nothing. On the right-hand side, we have another diagram of a somewhat typical garden scene at probably in June. We have rows of little plants growing in the foreground, and that polyethylene cover in the background is covering sensitive plants like tomatoes and basil and so on. What that has done is imposed another layer between the cold ground layer and what is radiating into space. So we've created a new layer, and if you measured the temperatures on top of that polyethylene, you'd find it was very cold. Our example is it's down to 0 degrees, which would be, if not fatal, a setback for our tomatoes underneath. But that layer of polyethylene will elevate the temperature in that enclosure by at least a couple of degrees. And probably if you knew, say the forecast was down to 3 degrees, 4 degrees, probably you want to cover anyway. 2 reasons. One is that the forecast could be optimistic and the temperature goes down to 0. Or another reason is that any kind of temperature below 5 degrees will set back your tomatoes and basil and so on. And it'll take a day or two recovering, even if it's not frost damaged. So other ways we can extend the growing season, we can use certain varieties of various plants. We can find more suitable pepper plants, tomato plants, and that vital thing, covering what we don't want to have exposed to extreme cold temperatures. So here's a little, you don't have to pay a lot of attention to this, but this is sort of a summary of what happens with frost in Thunder Bay. These are official temperatures from the airport. It varies a little bit. If you're closer to the lake, it'll be different. If you're inland, it'll be also different, usually colder at night. Anyway, this is a summary If you look at this, you'll find that our growing season is not very long. These are average dates in May and September, and the growing season on average is about 114 days. That's old news a little bit because it's a little more because of climate change. Our growing season is longer now. But if we look at the extremes, we can find that sometimes we have, if we knew in advance, we could start our growing season early. In this example down here, we could have started maybe on May 14th and gained a week or two in the growing season. But on the other hand, sometimes the temperature freezes long after that ideal date and long after the long weekend that we're coming up to now. Same kind of deal with in the fall time. We can have frost as early as August, and occasionally it can go into October. So it's a bit of a gamble. So the range of possibilities is considerable. Here's a glance of one of the benefits of climate change is that the growing season, this is an average temperature in the growing season from May inclusive through September. So over time, in the last, 70 years ago or so, we've had a gradual increase in the growing season and the temperature of it. The problem is that you can see there's lots of years in there that the growing season was not very long, and the temperature was colder than normal, even if we have a new kind of normal with the temperatures. So briefly, I'll mention some of the changes in the growing season and what has climate change has meant in the northwest of Ontario. Mostly we have growing seasons that are longer. I should caution that we have more variability, so we could have exceptionally long growing seasons, but also cold and frost at not appropriate times in the growing season. But we do have a movement for more pests and more weeds, different kind of weeds that we dealt with in the past. A big change is that we have new intruders in our situation, like raccoons, deer, and so on, that didn't used to be here. One of the big changes is the reliability of rainfall. It used to be that we could almost guarantee that we have about 25 millimeters of rainfall per week. Of course, it would vary a little bit, but if you look in your gardening manual, you'll find that that's ideal. If you had that every week, you wouldn't have to do very much watering at all. But we do have more hot days. And one of the things that has changed a lot, and we can prepare a little bit for, is that we have more intense precipitation events in the summertime. We have a heavy rainfall. Depending on the timing of that, that could wash out the plants, that the seeding that you've just done, because the plants aren't established, and we can have erosion in the garden. We have more intense storms, more frequent hail, and the good news, we have fewer frost days once we get into the growing season. So I think we'll open it up to questions now. I could say a few things. Maybe I'll say to initiate this by talking about germination right now, because that's a big topic for, I think, most people watching and listening today. So for a lot of plants we're going to grow this year, some of them should already be started, tomatoes, peppers, basil, and so on. We could Usually, one of the questions is from people is, where do I get my seeds? Well, sometimes it's using seeds from the past and selecting the best plants and keeping those seeds. So those tomatoes, for example, were put into soil in small pots. How many weeks ago? A few weeks ago now. And I just went through the task of repotting them, because at a certain stage, and it's probably fairly obvious if you have a big plant in a small container, like an egg shell container, and it's falling over, probably it's best to move it into a larger pot, and then nurse them along until you plant it directly into the garden. So another technique, some people I've heard from this year have had difficulty with germination using old seeds. Well, it's a little risky because seeds deteriorate over time. That can be as little as 1 or 2 years, but sometimes you can use seeds that are 5, 6, 7 years old. You expect poorer germination, but you can still get away with many things. If you have a package of seeds that you have doubts about, an easy technique is to sprinkle them on a paper towel and wet the towel and keep it at a reasonable temperature and see what sprouts. And with, well, some finesse, you can move those sprouts into soil once you have seen what's germinating and what is not. So Rachel, I think we'll turn it over to general questions and discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, Graham. We have, and for folks, just as a reminder, if you have a question, go ahead and type that into the Q&A box and I'll see that on my end. So one question that we have right now is, it has like an intro, which is great. I'm going to include it all and then get to the question. So with climate change, predicting the timing of when to plant things feels even more challenging. I'm currently researching using phenological indicators to determine when to plant things instead of the standard calendar. Do you recommend agrophenology to determine planting times, and/or what do you use to determine when you plant for your garden? So Graham, any thoughts about signs that you look for that indicate when you would plant, or what do you typically use?
Wiggett? Well, it's an excellent question, and it is changing over time. And it's a complicated question, so I'll deal with it as best I can. So what I do is I nurse these plants along. Some of them are seedlings and they become little plants and they're ready to go into the garden. But then I look at what's forecast for the next week or so. Beyond a week, I look at that, but it's not so reliable. But I think if we have good weather in our terms, that's no frost at night, and we're worried about what's going to happen with our tomatoes and peppers, then we take a look at the forecast, and if we see that there's no forecast of frost for a week, or maybe an outlook for 2 weeks, then we say, okay, the plants are getting overgrown and root bound in their containers. I'm going to take the word of the forecast with a bit of a grain of salt. I'll get to that. And I'm going to plant these tomatoes and other warm seeking plants in the garden now. Okay, once you do that, you have to be prepared to protect them if the forecast goes astray or something changes. So, and that often happens where we live. Sorry about it, but just because the frost free day is supposed to be such and such doesn't mean it's always the case. So once you have planted plants, warm plants like peppers, tomatoes in the ground, then you have to be willing to cover and protect them. There's a few different ways you can do that. I mentioned earlier in the slide, cover them. And you can actually build a structure ahead of time. So it's not quite that easy ever, but especially one or two people can pull a polyethylene barrier over on top. And as I mentioned, that'll give you protection by at least a couple of degrees and even more. So you do that. Say you want to go to bed at a sunset, and you go outside and you say, wow, it's kind of chilly. And the temperature is going down too fast. And I'm going to look at the forecast and they're saying, oh, it's going down to +2. I'm going to make the decision to cover the garden anyway, because it could be 2 or 3 degrees wrong. Once you venture this far, you have all these plants growing in the garden, you don't want to lose them. And you won't usually, if there's a late frost, you won't be able to run to your nursery and get replacements. So, and also the labor you've already put into it. So cover the plants and get up early in the morning and see how it's doing. And probably anything under cover will be fine. Perish the thought, but imagine that you get up really in the morning or early in the morning, you think, oh, what an idiot I am. I should have covered the plants. I can see a little bit of frost on the garage roof and a hint of frost on the grass next to the garden. You can then break out your gardening hose. It's too late to cover them at this point, and start spraying on those plants a fine mist of water. What happens there is that even if the temperature is going below 0 and freezing, we have a neat physical thing that happens here. The ice that is forming on your plant, say it's a tomato plant or a squash, will release latent heat, and that'll create a little barrier of air between your ice and your plant, and it'll rescue. I've done this down to 5 degrees of frost with zucchini plants. Okay, I kept watering them. The ice would form. I wash it off and wet them again, and they lived. Okay, so it's possible to do it. You want to do the covering technique if you can, but if you forget, then you can do that. So that's one of the things we can do to adapt to mostly better growing situations, but we have to be prepared to cover those plants, or if we miss it, water them in the morning. And some of you probably have plants that are too big in extent to actually cover. For example, we have grapes, and it would be quite a fight to cover them with plastic, probably dangerous, falling off a ladder. So what we do there is whatever temperature, once it's down around freezing, we start to water in the morning, and that works too. Same technique of even if it freezes, it's going to set up that barrier, and most of your vegetation will survive a frost in those situations. I should mention that a lot of our plants, cool weather crops like peas and carrots, don't need special treatment most of the time. They will cope with a degree or 2 of frost, and so you can be nice if you want to cover them, but you really don't have to. or watering in the morning. You don't have to do it. It's probably better for the plants, but it's labor intensive. And the critical ones are the warm plants like tomatoes, pepper, basil, and so on. That was a long answer.
That's okay. Thank you. And thank you. I had not heard of agrophenology before, so thanks to the person who asked that question. Great. Okay. Our next question is, which plants do you typically plant first? And so I think another way to think of that is, which plants go in earlier because they're a little bit more tolerant to the cold? What would you plant sooner in the year?
Yes, again, it's a matter of the cool weather crops can go in fairly early. And I know some people in Sioux Lookout who planted peas like 2 weeks ago, and the peas were up, and then the cold weather came and so on. And with a little bit of um, assistance, the peas are making it through the cold weather that we had. So what you should be thinking about in your garden plan is planting cool weather plants like peas, lettuce, peas, and others like parsnips will work too. And put them in the ground. Once your soil temperature gets even, well, for carrots, it should be up to 6, 7, 8 degrees. But even in lettuces and peas, if the temperature of the soil gets cold again, and the temperature goes down to 3, 4 degrees, it doesn't, well, it doesn't, I was going to say it doesn't matter. Probably it matters a little bit, but it doesn't kill the plants. They'll take a pause of a day or two and then grow again. So cool weather crops go in first, and then that gives you some spacing of time. Your plants like tomatoes and peppers are growing in the greenhouse or the house. And once we get into, let's see, later May, then they can go in into the ground, and the carrots, etc., will be fine. And they probably will be too, with the proviso that if things turn badly, then you cover them and or water them.
Great, thank you. And for any folks who are wondering what else might count as a cool weather crop, a quick Google search can give you a nice list of those as well. And just, I did remember we have folks joining us from the US as well as Canada today. So all degrees are in Celsius, just so you know, not Fahrenheit. That's probably pretty obvious, but just wanted to share that. Wonderful. So we have two questions, both about soil. One is asking about the volume of soil. So we have a beginner gardener. They have 2 above ground raised beds. What type of soil would you recommend for filling them? Sounds like they would need about, oh, sorry, they gave the volume. They need about a yard of soil to fill the 2 boxes. So wondering about types of soil, which ties into this other question about the safety of soil that comes in plastic bags. Just wondering about cross-contamination or safety of different soil options.
Okay, I'll start with a general review of soil. So ideally, what you want is a sandy soil because it has good drainage. You want some clay in your soil because it retains moisture and it has more minerals than sandy soil will have. And then you want a great deal of organic matter. That can come from peat moss. It can come from your gardening composting system, and the more organic matter you have in the soil, the better it is for nutrition reasons, moisture retention reasons, and soils that are easier to work with, digging in and planting and so on. So that's what you're striving for. Often it takes, and the soils vary a lot in Canada. You could have soil that is too sandy. It's great for drainage, but it dries out very quickly. So you want to add a lot of organic matter to that, and even a little bit of clay and maybe silt and so on if it's available to make that soil more water retentive. And certainly around where I am, we have a lot of clay in the soils. So you want to add a lot of organic matter to break it up and let it go. So you won't, all of these have pros and cons. The clay soils will have a lot of mineral content for the plants already there. So you won't have to add as much other items to that particular garden. Is that enough about that one, or do we want to explore a little bit? Oh, back to how much soil do you need? Well, it depends on what you're growing. If it's certain things like lettuces and are fairly shallow root systems, so you don't need as much soil as you would with, say, carrots, parsnips, beets, because they have a fairly large root system that goes into the ground for some distance. So it depends on what you want to specialize in. And if you have a choice and you have, this example was about raised beds, you might have one designed for carrots, and you may have one designed for squash and another one for lettuces and so on, and vary the amount of soil, that the depth of soil according to what's going to grow in those very precise and selected areas.
Great, thank you. Do you have any thoughts about different places you could buy soil that is not in plastic, or if you do buy a bag of soil in plastic, is that generally considered safe?
Well, I guess if I had my druthers, I would find a place where there was soil and maybe a situation, this would be ideal, but say you found a farm situation and you found an area where there had been manure in the same place for a lot of years, you could take that away and you're adding it to something, sand or clay, and add it to that, and that would be ideal. Bags and plastic, they're probably okay. I'm not big on plastics for all the reasons that I think viewers are thinking about, but they're probably okay. It reminds me of one of the questions that somebody who sent in wondered about what happens with some of their transplants. They die off, they become spindly and keel over. Now that could be, I think, as I said, I think most of the soil that you get in a plastic bag is probably okay. But if you had, for any reason, your soil had some kind of, I'm not sure I should use the word virus in this term these days, but if it has some kind of virus that is not compatible with plants, you could have that situation where you had it affecting your seedlings. It's called damping off, and then that's very serious for the plants because they just don't make it. So the short answer is, if you don't have a choice, use soils in plastic. If you want to be reasonably certain about it, spread it out in the sunshine, and the IV ultraviolet radiation from the sun will likely deal with any of those problems that I just talked about.
Great, thank you. If you have questions, go ahead and send them in. I'm wondering if we could talk briefly about any crops that people are wondering about, crops that go in perhaps in the fall and then overwinter. If you have any thoughts on that, Graham, perhaps garlic comes to mind for me, but any thoughts on plants you could plant in the fall and then overwinter and come up then in the spring?
Yes, well, you're right with the garlic. You really want to plant it in the fall, and it'll overwinter generally with really good results. And you can experiment a little bit with carrots and parsnips. And this doesn't always work, but if you have a way of covering those plants, they're still, you've harvested what you want, but you have too many carrots. Just imagine that. So you want to have a situation where you can get snow on top of them in a constant cover of snow through the winter. And how you do that exactly, I'm not sure. Maybe it's luck. Last year was luck because the snow came early, and we have parsnips and a few carrots from last year still in the garden. They're exceptionally good. Obviously, that's one of the first things you can eat out of the garden if you succeed in getting a few carrots through the winter, and they're incredibly tasty because they've set up all sorts of sugars in the weeks, months they were in the ground. So they're sweeter and better tasting than most carrots that you ever will experience. So that's a little hit and miss, because if the timing isn't right, then you end up with mushy carrots, and they're not much good for anything. And usually we'll miss a few onions and potatoes, and often they will winter again with that luck of having a snowfall that comes early and goes through the winter. You'll have, whether you wanted to have them in the ground or not, you'll have some leftover onions and potatoes. So you can experiment. If you have lots of space, you can do a little experimenting with some of these situations. As I mentioned, the carrots in this overwinter situation are exceptionally good. Other things do it themselves. Usually parsley will come back the second year. And you'll have they don't last more than that, but you have a second crop of parsley, fairly without a lot of fuss. And then there's a few herbs that will make it through the winter. The better results are with that snow or some kind of cover to shelter them. And then a favorite is chives. And it's almost that's almost an invasive species. You can have I can't imagine it myself, but too many chives. But they come through the winter very, very well.
Great, thank you for those ideas. A couple other questions have come in. And Graham, I don't know how comfortable you feel answering this, but I'll ask it and you let us know. So someone has existing planters on their property, and they're wondering how safe they are. So thoughts about railroad ties or creosote or pressure treated wood, anything that might have chemicals, and if the vegetables will or will not absorb those chemicals. So thoughts about what the planters might be made of already.
Yeah, I think that's an astute question. I wouldn't touch them if they were in creosote, railway ties, or pressure treated wood. I wouldn't consider using the soil from that or the planter itself. You could, it's too expensive to do this, but I suppose you could check this by getting the soil tested. I think you would find that you have heavy metals that you don't want into being in a planter, and how much precisely your plants will absorb these heavy metals, I don't know, but I think it's best to err on the side of caution with that one. I sort of a semi anecdote about that. Um, I knew some people who were getting their well water from a well underneath their pressure treated deck, and I said, you have to be crazy to do that. And they did have it tested, and sure enough, it was loaded with heavy metals and so on. That's what preserves the wood, but you don't want to ingest it yourself.
Thank you. And for that person, perhaps depending on it, maybe you grow flowers in those beds if you don't want them to go to waste, but not something that you're going to ingest. That definitely
precisely. That's a really good. Yeah, Rachel, that's a great way to deal with that.
Could still put them into use, but perhaps not for edibles. Okay, we have a question about zucchini. Based on last year, my zucchini started to rot on the flower end of the fruit while it was still on the plant. Any ideas on what might have caused that or how to prevent it?
The short answer is no, I don't. For whatever good luck, we haven't had that problem, but I've witnessed it in other gardens. And so I don't know, it's beyond my skill set to know what's happening with that. Probably it's worth a little trip online to see what other people are saying about that.
Okay,
well, last note, it could be a little bit to do with watering frequency. If they're getting too much water, that could be a problem. And another tangent from that is that when you water, you want to water in the morning, not at midday, because that'll shock the plants that you're watering, and not in the evening, because if you do that, you have all this moisture and the possibility of mold growing overnight and affecting your plants. I'm not sure that blossom rot kind of problem with the zucchini is related to that, but it might be.
Okay, sounds good. Some other folks who have joined us suggested too much water or perhaps a soil fungus. So for that person who wrote the question, some things to consider. Wondering about the safety of growing in tires. Is there any, I've seen that recommended online myself, and someone's wondering if that is a safe option.
Well, you may be asking the wrong person. I don't do it, although and I might default to your idea of having a nice flowering bush that you're not going to eat the fruit from. And I get the idea because that would keep weeds and other intruders out of where you want to have these plants. And I don't have any evidence that anything leaches from these tires into plants. But I guess being kind of cautious about that, I would not recommend that at all.
Okay, so thank you. We're going to wrap up with a general question for you. Is there, aside from what you've told us today, is there any one big piece of advice that you would give anyone growing in the North? Is there anything we could all take away from today as a go-to message to bring with us into the summer?
Well, that's a tough one. I saw a question, that question or something like it in my list of questions that you sent me. I'm not sure I can limit it to one. One of the things that I think is important is to have something, maybe this is psychological benefit, back to chives. If you have chive plants strategically located in your garden, for example, critters like rabbits and things like that don't really like, and deer don't like chive plants. So you can use it as a barrier between that and what you want to protect. But also you can utilize these chive plants as soon as the snow is gone. So you have some benefit of your garden immediately. And you can you can sprinkle chives on top of whatever you want. This year, because of all these chives we have, we've been making chive pesto. So you make it the same as you would pesto out of basil leaves, but you don't have basil leaves, so you use chives. And so you use whatever portions of nuts and Parmesan cheese, and you make your pesto out of chives, and it's easily available and tastes great. So that, I think that's my main tip. Keep in mind that we have to watch the weather very carefully and do whatever it's appropriate once you're committed to keep your garden going.
Great. Those are great pieces of advice. And a few more questions have popped in actually, and we do still have a few minutes. So I might throw them at you.
Okay.
These ones hopefully are quick. If someone only has the option of watering in the evening, I assume because of work, but doesn't water every day in the evening, does that seem okay? Or is there an alternative you would suggest?
Well, as I mentioned already, best not to water in the evening. But if you don't have a choice, then I'd suggest watering at ground level, i.e. where the roots are, right at the soil level, rather than broadcasting water on by spray over a whole section of the garden. More labor intensive, but if it is at all possible, probably this is best most of the time, to water not on the leaves, but at ground level. Now that's labor intensive for sure, but that's where you want the water to go to, and it would diminish the possibilities of mold formation and so on, because of the way you're doing it, in spite of that labor intensive aspect.
Great, thank you. Another question, do you have any recommendations for testing soil? I think this person is asking on testing about chemicals in particular, as opposed to the type of soil. If you're wondering about type of soil, we have some resources on the Roots to Harvest website on that. But any ideas for where you would send your soil to be tested for particular chemicals?
Yeah, Lakehead University, they have a lab there, and I forget what it costs, but it's not inexpensive. But if you have, it'll give you a great deal of information about what you want to know about your soil. And I suggest, hopefully, you do it once, and then you remedy whatever is, say there's mineral deficiencies or something you don't want in the soil, you figure a way to get rid of it. So once you do it, I think you have done it. But listeners, viewers would have to think about whether that's worth the expense of doing it. But phone the university and talk to the people in the lab. They do all sorts of testing in that particular lab.
Yeah, and if you're joining us,
maybe we can get a bulk rate or something. I don't know.
That would be nice. If you're joining us from outside of Thunder Bay, I would recommend Googling what your local university or agricultural department might offer as well if you're not here. And then a quick question about melons. Any tips for growing melons? Do you need warming containers or just other tips about that type of plant?
We have reasonable success in growing melons. Eggplants is much more iffy, but we typically do get muskmelons, cantaloupes, and a few watermelons and so on. They need a lot of care, and you might even consider building some kind of structure around them so it retains more heat. And certainly anytime it's going to be cold, and for those plants, that's probably less than 10 degrees, but certainly 5 degrees would be a critical temperature. You shouldn't allow the temperature to go below 5 degrees with those plants. So you cover them. And even if it looks like the temperature is only going down to 5 or 6, then you cover them.
Great, thank you. And that brings us to 4 o'clock. I do want to end on time. So thank you, Graham, for joining us and sharing your information and knowledge. Very much appreciated. We've had thanks already in the chat, so that's wonderful. I just wanted to let everybody know, again, if you have feedback about the webinar, please email me. I will put that in the chat right now. And if you want to join us in the future, we do plan to host another webinar in June and July. Dates will be determined later. We will post them on the Roots to Harvest social media and website, so just stay tuned for that information later in the summer. And I hope you all have a great day. Happy gardening.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you.